Welcome to the second episode of the ASEF podcast, Let's Talk About Slovenian Art. My name is Tjaša and I'll be the host of this podcast. I'm an ASEF Junior Fellow 2021 and I'm a Ph.D. student of art history at Leipzig University. This ASEF podcast is devoted to art in Slovenia, where we will talk about Slovenian rich and versatile culture made up of folklore, customs, theatre, music, food, written words, and visual arts. In today's podcast, we are thrilled to welcome a Slovenian artist and researcher, Dr. Polona Tratnik, who holds a bachelor's degree in painting, a master's degree in sculpture, and her Ph.D. is in philosophy and theory of visual culture. Polona Tratnik is Dean of University, Faculty for Slovenian and International Studies, where she is a full professor for philosophy and art. She is a senior researcher at Institute IRRIS for Research, Development and Strategies of Society, Culture and Environment. She is the president of the Slovenian Society of Aesthetics and vice secretary general of the International Associations of Aesthetics. Her bibliography comprises more than 285 entries, of which she published 42 peer-reviewed articles, more than 40 book chapters, and 9 monographs, 2 in English, 1 in Spanish, and 1 translation in Serbian. Her research fields comprises aesthetics, philosophy of art and science, media theory, and interdisciplinary studies of fairy tales. She is also a pioneer bioartist. Dr. Polona Tratnik, thank you very much for joining me today. We are thrilled to have this conversation with you.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, and I also invite you. I think it's better to start with all the questions. We have many questions for you, and they're very interesting. So I hope we will have enough time to go through all of them. So your artistic and professional path is very inspiring. You started with traditional art, continued with theory, then intertwine everything with science. Can you tell us a little bit about how this love, if I can call it like that, started? When's this fascination with biotechnology?
I'm glad that you say that my professional path is very inspiring. However, it was often not easy, if I can say so. But what I could say is that it was, I think, always more or less spontaneous. So that I always was reacting spontaneously to the opportunities, topics, and situations that I confronted in my life. So you said that I actually started with a traditional sort of art. However, that's probably meant painting. So I studied painting. But already during this study, I was exploring the painting very much. So I was questioning what the painting means, where it ends, how we interact with it, and so forth. So then I studied sculpture, as you said, in my postgraduate studies, and that was again a kind of exploration. So what sculpture is then? So what does it mean, a sculpture in a space? What the space means? How do we perceive the space or something in it? Or what are these objects? Are there necessary objects to be confronted with in sculpture, and so forth? So many questions that arose, and one of them that I really found very interesting was the question of presence, the presence of a person in a space. So what this presence actually means, so how it establishes, through what, in what way, or in other words, in what way do people exist? How do they exist for other people? What is the concept of me, for instance? So how do I exist in the consciousness of somebody else, and how this actually spreads? And that also means that me and my identity doesn't end with me here, so how I perceive myself, but it actually spreads all around in this social sphere, and if you want, in history. So it has to do with timing and with other experiences that people have in their lives, and so forth. So when questioning this presence, as I said, I did some sculpture work that comprised photography or some wax sculptures, and I started to work with materials that really resembled the human flesh, or they were kind of imprints of that, so that we could even have not only the texture or structure of the skin present, but also the hair that was there in the body, and that then was left in the imprint of that body that was present then in the space that where I constructed or established this sculpture. So in a way, it was very spontaneous to further develop this idea of presence with what I heard at the time, and that was in 2000, that in the field of biotechnology, there is a rise of tissue engineering, and tissue engineering dealt with cultivating tissues. First of all that was skin, and of course I had this very strong imagination about what I will do with this skin that I will grow, and how this will be combined with my sculptures and so forth. And then I came in contact with a friend of mine, and by chance she did research, so she did her PhD study in tissue engineering of skin, and that was Metka Krašna. So then she actually enabled me to start to collaborate with Blood Transfusion Center of Slovenia, and she was working on tissue engineered skin, and I entered the laboratory, and I got this knowledge about how this works and so forth, and I was pretty much surprised how actually the skin that is engineered in the laboratory doesn't look like skin at all. So it looks like some other transparent liquids and so forth. So the first idea that I had that was evolved in the context of art was to bring this tissue engineering from the sphere of biotechnology into the sphere of domestic life, so ordinary life, the home, so to say, home. So then I considered about this concept. What is home? What is this domestic feeling? What is enabled with it, and the presence again? So the presence was still my concern. So for that occasion, and that was my master's also degree, then I established this installation with tissue engineered skin, and I combined that with the feelings that I wanted to provoke for the observer, that had to do with a very warm environment and dark environment. So in a way, I wanted to bring these people back to the warmth, so to say. So the very, very warm environment, dark environment, which you first feel very domestic and safe, and later on you don't feel so comfortable any longer. You want to go out, you want to be, so to say, free. So that was a kind of, as you asked, the beginning of this interest in biotechnology. Then further on, I had different interests. Generally, I would say that I combined this artistic interest with the research interests that was pretty much intertwined, and I was interested in the biopower that people realize with biotechnology. So how do we really use biotechnology in order to, I even said, conquest the body? So how do we find the ways to support, to enable salvations of health issues, which then also have to do with prolongation of active life, which then of course influences the economic sector, and how we have better, so to say, picture of the working people, which means of course profits for the society and so forth. So I mean, I was pretty much concerned with this, so to say, political aspects of biotechnology, and what does it mean for the society? What power does it have?
That's very interesting. It's so, and you work on so many fields in parallel with art and biotechnology, as you mentioned. But what is even more interesting for me, that you also write novels and short prose and poetry. I think in one of your interviews you mentioned that you also sing and you paint. In 2022, for example, you open the exhibition opening where you exhibited abstract paintings. You confronted there the viewer with somehow new, not so familiar part of yourself, if I can say like that, instead of the control and management you mentioned that is typical of your early works. You somehow allowed here openness and the space for changes. Can you tell us about your painting experience a little bit? Why turn here to, as we can say, traditional way of transmitting content?
Yes, that was nice how you connected it. So it was really in my, so to say, conceptual work or the biotechnological works that I did, I would say, which were very, I mean, highly conceptual, and they were also, I tried to uh, think them very well, also through this question of how the perceiver, the how people, how the observer will experience it. So that was detailedly planned, so to say. So how what will people see, feel, and so forth. So how to direct this experience, that was of course very much my concern in that cases. But also, of course, as I mentioned, I was concerned with the power of medicine and regenerative medicine in this case over life and the bodies, and what relevance that has for the politics of a society, of populations. And that in a way was a kind of in a way I pushed that to some extreme, so to say, and I came to one level, so to say, that was in a way very close to science in this ordinary sense. However, I wouldn't say that that was particularly science, even though these projects were very transdisciplinary made. As you said, that I turned then to painting, and that was now it's difficult to count, but I think about 20 years of posing in that regard. But before I really, I mean, I did painting, of course, I studied that, I was exploring it, I was questioning it, so forth. But in a way, as you said, in other practices, I don't do that all at the same time, like writing novels, poetry, and so forth. There are certain phases. So I did write one novel, which I didn't really complete and then publish, but I did write short prose. I even got some rewards for that. And I did write poetry. Poetry, for instance, is pretty similar to the practice of paintings. I mean, these media are very different in their character, and painting, as I understand it, or as I am interested in, I would say, as I'm interested in, has this very interesting dimension that it can seduce you. So it can seduce you. It invites you in a dialogue, and it opens some perspectives that you could find surprising, and that you maybe cannot come to the end of. So that you can explore and then explore again, and then on this depends on your day, on your everyday experiences. So that changes then, and so forth. And then I find this dimension of painting very, very, very interesting, and I think that painting in this regard still has a future. Even I would say that that maybe painting is a very, very interesting media in contemporary world, particularly because of that, because the society actually has more and more organized bureaucratic aspect. And I mean, we live in a reality where we write projects, we write reports, we have to be very precise, exact, we have to pack things very carefully, we have to plan in details, and so forth. So with the painting is pretty much different. So you really, I mean, I love it also, the practice of it. Like when you start, you approach, and I want to leave it open from the beginning to the end, so to say, so that I really establish a situation then that can start inviting me or speaking to me, and so forth, so that I can come in a dialogue. So, and then this dialogue becomes more and more interesting when you're doing the painting, because it surprises you, and it's about a rhythm that I would compare in a way to breathing or dancing or a sort of music, and compared to breathing or say walking, it's also different in the way that it's a very, you have to be bold when you're doing it, because you do some moves that you don't have control over, so that you really don't know exactly what will come out and how this will look like. And it's also true that very often what you do doesn't feel good to you. It doesn't, you don't like it, or you find it clumsy or very unsuccessful and so forth. So you have to be so to say ready to confront with all these failures or unsuccess, so to say, which I find it's very similar to life. Like it's not always about good ends and successful stories. So it's a lot about some trying, some situations which you don't understand, which you don't like, which you have to react something, you have to do something and so forth. So in a way, painting is very similar to life in that regard, as I said. So I said, okay, opening, this is really something that comes first to my mind. It has to do with the opening. You have to be open, and you have to be able also to confront with all what's coming, and what's there to speak with you and so forth. So, and maybe at this occasion I would also say that when I'm confronted with a very good painting of some masters like Per Kirkeby or Max Beckmann, for instance, or some other painters, I really feel this deep admiration. So it's something that it's difficult to compare with something else. So you come in, when you get confronted with paintings that are really good, they invite you and they don't let you go, and then you want to come again and so forth. I stayed for a while in Stuttgart, and I visited the Museum for Modern Art very, very often. I wouldn't say every day, but very, very often. And I was watching Max Beckmann's paintings, for instance, for hours and so forth. So paintings have this, whatever to call, so kind of magic, so to say, to really, so that you can come and that you can come in contact and so forth. So I wouldn't say that it's, I mean, that expression, that it's expressionism, so that it's about me, my feelings and so forth. I wouldn't agree so much. I mean, I don't like that description so much, because it's not so much about me and how I feel. Of course it comes out of me and so forth, it has to do with that as well, but that's not the real point. Like, for instance, when I look at Per Kirkeby's painting, I'm not interested in him and his feelings, but in what this painting really does to me. So how it gets me involved in some situation, and how it opens up new dimensions and so.
Very interesting thinking. It's also, I think, the way how we look at the painting, or probably what kind of, I don't know, situation we are with the painting. And also when you said sometimes you don't like what you've done, but maybe if you come back next day, or if you keep coming back, then maybe, you can just change something and then it will be just right. So that's what I find very interesting as well with the process.
Yeah, the process, and this process, you cannot predict how much it will take. Like, of course you come again, and that's also something that's very interesting. Like, when I do a painting, it takes a while, it takes a long time, and then sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and then I go and just look at it. And so, and of course sometimes you see and sometimes you don't, and sometimes you're just a kind of blind, and you need to take a lot of time to get this kind of distance. And it's similar, in a way it's similar to writing articles. When you write something and maybe you find an idea very interesting, I mean, that's different, of course, but then you write something and you think that's very interesting, but then you come in a way blind. You cannot establish this distance, and you cannot really see what stands well and what is missing and so forth, and you need to leave it for a while. So you need to leave it for a while. This one could take a year if you want. So then you approach again, and maybe it happens that you just see, then you see and you know exactly, so this is missing and so forth. Sometimes you see that something is missing, but you cannot find a way how to how to solve it. And it also happens that sometimes you think that one work is very, I mean, it's good and so forth, it's dynamic or whatever, it's interesting. And then after a while, you look at it and you think, wow, but it's really falling apart or something like that. So this view change, I mean, really change a lot. So that's also part of the game.
Good. So maybe we go now a little bit more general. What do you think, or what is your opinion of the role of art today? Then in general, or maybe if we are more specific in Slovenia.
I'm not sure that I would really divide Slovenia and the rest of the world or something like that, because now we really live in a globalized world. And I think for a while that was quite an issue. I mean, even when we thought that we are all part of this same globalized world, I felt pretty much that how the history of art, for instance, was written in the 20th century with giving priority to Western art. So I and then there were some scholars that really tried to warn how actually there are very interesting artists working in the Eastern Europe or eastern part of the world that don't get the attention that they would deserve, so to say. So then you would have some artists who would really be successful in doing this breakthrough, so to say, in the world, like Neue Slowenische Kunst, for instance. And in today's situation, I would say that we have artists who are globally accepted or very admired, so to say. For instance, the sphere of bioart, I found out that in this first decade of the 21st century, when people were doing these books with surveys or addressing the biotechnological art, I think that was still pretty much the case, so that they didn't really pay attention to people who are coming from the second world, I would say, so that they are not part of the first world. So that sometimes even happened that people from the third world or the cultures from the third world were, that the theorists and scholars found very interesting as a kind of otherness or something like that. And then the second world was a kind of not seen, not so to say. But I think that today differences are getting more and more evident, or maybe they are not even relevant any longer. So as concerns this field of biotechnological art that I mentioned, I would say that we have a very strong scene. So we have some artists that are really good, that did some very good projects, and that were able to show these projects in the world, the venues that are the most important venues of the world. So that I think we could really be proud. But of course, this doesn't come just by itself. It has to do with the tradition, so to say. It has to do, I would say, Kapelica Gallery and Yuri Karpan, they have a very important role in that, in this continuous interest for art at the edge, so to say, or very particular and very well conceptualized artistic interest, and also stimulation of the artists for doing that kind of things on the one hand, and on the other hand, the events and the projects that have been done, so that these people really come in contact with the people, with the projects, with the theories, if you want, and so forth. So that has to do with how you really develop, if I use this phrase, so that you really, what you do from you, how you educate. And from this perspective, of course, I think all this has relevance for the art that we have today, and that is very relevant in the international sense. At the same time, I would say that for our particular space, it is very important the tradition of critical theory. So, because in the second half of the 20th century, in the world of aesthetics, critical theory had a very strong importance, and people were really growing up with that. And as you asked, how do I understand art today? I would say that I also originate from that, or that I share this perspective that it's a very important function of art to have a sort of social relevance, so that it really addresses some questions that are questions of our age, of questions of the future, questions of our everyday life, or big issues, maybe some changes that are coming from with biotechnology, for instance, and so forth. So in that regard, I think that art is responding to the world with new technologies, the topics that are coming, the questions that are, for instance, now what is interesting is artificial intelligence or ecology. How can we find new perspectives to connect with other living species, and particularly on that aspect, we have completed a book together with my colleague and friend of mine, Maria Antonia Valerio Gonzalez, and I hope it's coming out in 2022. That's this year, and the title is "Through the Scope of Life: Art and Biotechnologies Philosophically Revisited." So, and the other aspects that I emphasized that have to do with this emancipatory role of art, that have to do with art exploring new media and so forth. I have written quite a lot about address these questions, in particular in the book that I recently published, Art as Capital. So it's titled Art as Capital: The Intersection of Science, Technology and the Arts. So it came out with Roman and Littlefield in 2021 in the summertime. So on the other hand, I would say what I mentioned before, that art also has this role that I was speaking about as regards the painting, so that maybe that it's a more private experience, which invites you to connect, to contemplate, to think about things, and to get more open, in a way, to get out of this over systematized world, and to open in that sense also to spontaneously, to rhythms, to the senses, which I think it's very important for the art to really work on the sensual experience.
It's a very interesting topic as well, because as we as spectators are experiencing all these new approaches in art, especially such as these new technologies as VR, for example, and that's how the spectators needs to kind of be a part of it, or how they find their way in this art, which is very interdisciplinary. I think it is as never been before. But, well, if I ask you maybe a little bit connected to that, what do you think is the biggest challenge? Maybe we are talking about how the art is progressive, but what is the biggest challenge maybe that Slovenian art is facing today, or global art?
I mean, speaking about global, of course, there are also some other issues with that notion. So, what does it mean? Or are there again some cultures that are more hegemonic in that regard? Or are we really paying regard to all this, to the situations and places and cultures where maybe people live more traditional way of life and so forth? So, I think that with this notion of the globalized world, we also need to be careful, because it's not all the same all the way around, so to say, because you would still have differences, you would have different traditions, and people live in different cultures. Maybe digital world is not so present in all the parts of the world, so forth. So, but speaking globally, we could say that today we live in a digitalized world, especially now because of the COVID pandemic, even more. However, that's not the situation for everybody. Some people really live in some, I wouldn't say remote parts of the world, because then this creates a center somewhere else, but that they don't use digital technology. So as you ask, what would be the challenge for art? I mean, art really has, in a way, difficult tasks. So in one hand, there is a strong interest for art, which we can see when we go to some festivals and to some venues, which are very well visited. Or if you go to museums, and you would have very long waiting lines and so forth. So obviously there is interest in art. On the other hand, there is strong interest in the art market. So people are buying art and so forth, and this has not ended. So of course that's another aspect of the interest of art. Then you would have domains such as industry, or for instance European calls enable artists to join some collaborations with technologies and scientists and so forth, and to explore, to bring out some new solutions or innovative ideas and so forth, which industry would need a lot. So I mean, art has there is interest for art, and there are several tasks that art could do. However, I think it's also important for art to find its specifics, so that it does not only do tasks that are interesting for other domains. So speaking in that terms, that it doesn't get always in service, so to say. I mean, somebody would resist and would say it's not a service if somebody explores a creative industry, so forth. But still, it's in service of the capital, because there is a certain interest in the end to sell the product, to solve an issue that is so forth. So sometimes, I mean, I think it's also important that art works on its gained autonomy, so to say, as it gained autonomy during the era of modernity, and this was its very important achievement. So today we're speaking about art connecting and art being in collaborations, doing things that also serve, of course, somebody else and so forth. So that is a challenge for art, to find its particularness, so to say, and to in a way show that it is a sort of a special practice, that it has some specifics that could still be interesting and so on. And that I think it does not necessarily mean that we need to go back to some traditional forms and so, but that would be interesting, because for instance you would have many artists who would, and you mentioned virtual reality, like it of course that's a new technology, and you could have artists who would use smart apparatuses like phones and so forth, or you would have artists who would go into the laboratories and so forth. I mean, these artists often face a challenge how to develop her or his own perspective, or something that is not to be understood as science or as just mere exploration of the media. So we're playing with technology. So with, for instance, virtual reality, I think it was a sort of technology very dangerous, so to say, in conditionally say dangerous in the sense that I mean, if the technology is very demanding, so that you have to be skilled. Or for instance, now I recently we just worked on a laboratory workshop joining art, science, humanities, technology, so forth, in CRISPR-Cas9 technology, with the goal to open this technology for artists. And that's, for instance, a case where the technology is pretty much demanding, or there are parts of it which I would call black box. Black box, because there are parts of it which you cannot understand, cannot reach with your understanding, so that really remain unknown or unperceivable, so to say. And then it's very difficult to work with, if there are, I mean, but still, I mean, that's also a challenge, like if you're working with the black box. But don't forget that, for instance, when people started working with photography, that was also, camera was a black box, because there are parts which you don't, I mean, understand. You can technically explain, but to when you work with photography as an artist, so to say, there are parts of this process that you cannot completely predict, and that you cannot have complete control of that. So that's also a part of the challenge. around. So how to work with technologies that you cannot really be completely trained in and have complete control of. So to be able to open questions, address interesting artistic, issues, and open new perspectives when you don't completely understand what is going on and what does it mean. So I mean that art has many challenges and interesting tasks in contemporaneity that we should search for.
That's for sure. And also, I think for the viewers, it's important to kind of gain somehow some knowledge to be a part of that, or to be able to look at the new art or the art today. I think that's also one of the challenges, as you mentioned before. And also you mentioned your newly published book, Art as Capital. Can you tell us a little bit about that book, or what inspires you to write the book?
Yeah, actually, this book, it was not written in a year or very shortly. It's something that I worked on for years, that I previously published in some parts and that I further developed and so forth. So I would say one very important aspect of it is that I defend art as a emancipatory practice, so practice that is really opening new perspectives of the common things could be, or that really maybe show some hidden mechanisms of power structures and so forth. So I mean that was one of, or I would say maybe even the main inspiration to really defend that sort of art. On the other hand, there is interest in art and science and technology that I work on in this book, and that I really trace back to the beginnings of the modern era, the beginning of modernity, and link that beginnings with the contemporary age. So, for instance, this traversion of the from the mythical thought to the scientific mind or instrumental mind that took place, and that was very important for science, for instance. For art, on the other hand, it is still interesting to preserve interest in mythical thought or magical aspects. For instance, that's a question. For instance, I'm interested in, because it has to do with imagination, with projections, with what I talked about, with this unknown that you work with and that you don't have complete control of. So, and then of course, as the title also says, I wanted to speak about two things: art as capital, in the sense that art is something precious, something that we have to take care of, so to say, also to defend, in the sense to support public money, to enable public funding for it, because if it just goes to the market, then I mean some of artistic functions are endangered in that case. And on the other hand, art is capital also in the sense that it has entered the art market. And of course, this issue of the monetary issue is very important for the art venues, museums, and so forth, and also for the works of art. So I also address that, and I also address the fact that we live in this consumer world, and I speak about consumerism in relations to the environments where this consumerism really seduces you, which is the shopping malls and so forth. So then I pose questions such as how can art really address that kind of topics and related topics, if like for instance, recently I traveled to Zagreb, and I wanted to take my child to the science museum, and I was not able to, because it closes at 1 o'clock or something like that, on Saturday. And at the same time, I had to buy something. I went to a shopping mall. It was completely full and so forth. So I said, I mean, how could you then, expect people to have interest in art and so forth if everybody go to the shopping mall? So I then also addressed this question of how can art really act as regards shopping and consumerism if everybody is in the shopping malls seduced with this environment, so forth. So that would be shortly about this book.
Lovely. And you were also, which I found very interesting, a leader of the project Social Functions of Fairy Tales, where you were researching how fairy tales, especially you mentioned the famous Cinderella tale, encapsulate the social reality of the certain time, which is incredibly interesting, especially because tales are very important, part of our childhood. Can you share your thoughts about this project? Are they any similarities with Slovenian tales, and what is kind of the role of visual arts in a fairy tales?
Okay, the role of visual art in the fairy tales. Maybe I can begin with that because I can speak about fairy tales for a long time. So the role of visual arts, you mean like illustrations and so that
Yes.
accompany fairy tales? I mean, yes, I would say very, very important for fairy tales as children's literature, which has not always been the case. So when we have editions of fairy tales in contemporaneity that are meant for children, I think the illustrations that accompany them are equally important as the tales themselves. So, and I think that should be maybe stronger supported by the state or in the education system. As I noticed, I don't think that illustration has any kind of protection in the educational space, which means that then children, for instance, work on some tales and the illustration would be just removed or replaced with some kind of strip or something. I mean, a cartoon, or I mean something that's not really a qualitative product from the aesthetic perspective. If you consider about some illustrators that really influence the whole generations of people growing up, for instance, speaking about Slovenia, as Roža Piščanec, for instance, who was very, very important for me, in particular with the Hansel and Gretel edition written by France Beuk, which is also something special and very, very interesting, very good. Jelka Reichman, for instance, Marlenka Stupica, and then recently there was a documentary produced by the Slovenian radio and television, and I recommend that documentary. It's a very good one, and it presents three generations of Stupicas, the painters. I mean, all of them are illustrators, and this documentary also very well speaks about the relevance of these artists, in particular Malenka Stupica, who really marked the whole generations that were growing up with her illustrations. More recent illustrators that I would pick up would be Marianca Jemec Božič, for instance, who is doing lots of illustrations for Anja Stefan, who is a very, very good writer as well of the fairy tales, and more artistic sort of illustrations by Anja Jerčić, for instance, which I also find very, very aesthetically nice, very compelling. And the other thing that you asked, so fairy tales and what about that? So, I mean, as I said, I could speak for a long time. I have been the leader of this project, which has not ended yet, but I also continue to work on this topic, which I find very, very interesting, and there are new and new topics and dimensions opening up with that, and so I'm just working on that in this moment. You mentioned Cinderella. That's a case that I have been studying, so I studied it for a long time. So I focused, for instance, in the Renaissance period, and then I focused on the Baroque period, and of course I also paid attention to the Slovenian editions. There are about, I think, more than 30 that I listed from the tradition, so to say. I didn't really follow this very recent, so to say, sometimes I say like fast food production because it's like when you go to a shopping mall and then they sell, for instance, bread and powder and things like that, and then next to that you would buy a fairy tale for 1 year or something like that. I mean, usually these are very problematic editions, really problematic. The text is very short and it's not well I mean, it's not very well conceptualized. I mean, it's very poor quality, and it's a shame that people then buy that kind of things, because in this case, then you have a certain fairy tale at home, and then you think that you don't need another one, which is a, a very good, I mean, artistic work, so to say, that would be very good to have in your library and to keep it there for the generations to come. So why fairy tales? Like, of course, as you mentioned, they shape our childhood already. Then we grow up with them. I mean, even if we are not aware of that, later on we compare. Like, for instance, people would go and watch a Hollywood production of Cinderella, for instance, just because they have a kind of memory of that from their childhood or something like that. So in a way, we live with this concepts that we met in the fairy tales. But it was not always the case that fairy tales would be meant for children. That's so to say, a purpose that they gained very lately, so to say, in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, it was not that they were not told to children before. I mean, they were told to children in the 17th century, or probably earlier as well, or they were told to different sort of populations, including the children, but not particularly the children. But in the 19th century, they became material that was, so to say, systematically, so programmatically or politically, if you want, as I mentioned before, in reference to biotechnology. Here I'm again interested in this political role of fairy tales. So politically, fairy tales became interesting for education of children, and they even use this term as the mother's milk. So something that we come in contact very early in our life, and that really influences us later on. So that really happened in the 19th century in the context of romanticism, and there were these German educators that really did a plan to work on the fairy tales and to stimulate certain characteristics, to show what is good, what is bad, and so forth. And they used the fairy tales of Brothers Grimm, for instance, for that occasion, which were published in many editions, and only one of them was adapted for children, but not. I mean, if we would go into details, I mean, there are certain aspects that are not so. I wouldn't say appropriate and so forth, but I mean, sometimes they, for instance, the Grimms, they emphasized some very brutal aspects that I would say, have more to do with the closeness of this genre to sort of thrillers, some genres from culture industry that are meant for people for the adults, so not for children. So how I understand fairy tales, I understand them as a sort of matrices, so to say, that they are matrices which change or adapt to certain social, cultural circumstances. So it depends on the context of the production, what will come out. So what aspects will be emphasized, or even maybe some motives would be removed, or if they were, for instance, certain previously, I mean, they were central in the previous editions, they perhaps could remain in the editions later on, but wouldn't be central and wouldn't have the same function any longer. That's very, very interesting. As for instance, now I work with self-amputation of a princess, which was a motive in the tales of the Middle Ages. And the function of that self-amputation, and also of the incestuous father, was very different already in the Middle Ages and later on. As for instance, in the Middle Ages, you would find two sorts of that story. One would be in the context of the Christian religion, and it would have to do with the message of complete devotion to God of this lady. And the other would be in the context of the rising legal society, speaking about the geostrategic interests, political interests, which were related to the incestuous father who was wanted to marry his daughter, which ran away, so she went to exile, and because of that, she was able to meet her future husband, another king, which enabled the growth of the kingdom. So the joining of two kingdoms and the enlarging of this European empire, for instance. And then in the Barocco, you would find pretty similar stories with completely different functions who would speak about what I would say accepting of the social contract, in the sense that this lady would be presented as running into the wilderness or becoming wild, becoming more natural. In this wilderness, she would, for instance, be also a killer, or I mean, it would be something what Thomas Hobbes, for instance, described as a natural state, as a state of everybody against everybody. So constant state of war. So this fairy tale, for instance, presents exactly that. And then when she comes back to the court, she accepts the social contract and she gets civilized, and she enters the civilized society. So obviously, fairy tales have to do with supporting the civilizing process, so called and analyzed by Norbert Elias. So the process that took place from the beginning of the modernity, and we could say that the fairy tales have these functions. However, I mean, they have gone through many transformations, and one of them I already mentioned. So fairy tales are a very important tool for civilizing people, for educating people, as we said in the beginning, that they have to do with how we grow up, with what norms and values we establish, and what are the concepts of the good and bad and right, and so forth. So that we establish. So we do all that through the fairy tales.
It's definitely a topic we could talk hours about it, right?
Sure.
And so also, I think that Alice in Wonderland is one of the fairy tales which is keep transforming through the time, and they are making movies, and I think an exhibition. I seen the exhibition in London, and you could. I was able to see all the different aspects of because the Alice in Wonderland. I never imagined that it was actually quite dark, and then now they change it for probably the different purposes or for the kids this generations. But
Yeah, yes. So you see, but it's also, for instance, sometimes you would have to do with some, I would say, matrices that maybe you wouldn't call so. Like, for instance, the case of James Bond, for instance, you would know it as James Bond, but you could recognize the structure of the hero, which has to win in the fight with a bad character, which could be linked to for instance, to the character of the dragon from the fairy tale, so forth. So, I mean, we would also find some motives or some structures that would originate from the fairy tales, and maybe they're not called like that, but they are transposed surely from that structure.
very interesting. I'm looking forward to more of your research, so I'll be able to read it. But as we are running out of time a little bit, let me ask you one last question. So you mentioned before that you're working on many projects at the moment, but is there any particular you would like to mention? An interesting book, new painting, exhibition on a read?
Okay, yeah, of course, I'm working on many things. I mentioned that I'm working on I'm doing research on fairy tales, and one topic that I'm particularly interested in this moment is this that I mentioned, this traversion to the modern society, modernization process, and the social contract. So that's something that I'm working on in the sense of some articles, but also some conceptualizations that really have very different dimensions that I wouldn't mention at this occasion, maybe at another occasion. Then I should be working on one artistic project that should be presented this year in Cukrarna at the group exhibition. So that's something that I owe to the curators. And then there's something that I'm really looking forward, and that is my studio. So that I'm completing my studio, and then I'm looking forward a lot to begin to paint in the studio, so that I will finally have a proper space where I could do these things, not only painting, but I have some other ideas as well that perhaps I would not really go into detail at this occasion, but that have to do, for instance, with artificial intelligence as well.
Oh, that's very exciting. And I'm looking forward to your exhibitions, and I hope I'll be able to see your studio as well. But thank you very much for your time and for this very interesting conversation. And also a big thank you to our audience as they joined us today on this podcast. And I hope they enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'm also looking forward to the next episode of Let's Talk About Slovenian Art. And thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Tjasa. Thank you very much for paying attention, for having this interest, and for inviting me, of course, here.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.